Hello, my name is Jonathan Garza, and today we're going to talk about the Pentateuch, how it is the start of God's redemptive rescue plan. So the Pentateuch constitutes the first 5 books of the Old Testament in the Bible, and they are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Generally speaking, these books are ascribed to Moses in authorship, although there might be some other compilers involved. These 5 books, the 5 texts, are also what's known as the Torah. So in Hebrew, Torah means law or teaching. Well, Pentateuch in Greek simply means 5 scrolls or 5 books. So here's the thing that can happen, even amongst believers. Many can believe that the Old Testament and the New Testament are different. They'll stick with the New Testament and think that the Old Testament instructs you, but it's the New Testament that brings the gospel or the good news of Jesus. And so there can be a disconnect even for Christians. The issue with this is if we cut off the Old Testament and its importance, then we cut off the whole picture of God's redemptive process. The gospel is no less in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament. We can find God's redemptive plan lived out through his dealings with Adam and Eve as they disobeyed. We can see God's redemption lived out through the life of Noah in Genesis 6. Through the call of Abraham out of the land of Haran. And later we can see it worked through in the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. But let's pull on this redemptive thread of God promising Abram that he would be with him and that he would give him a son. In Genesis 15, we find, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." Skipping forward a bit, verse 5. "And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven." This is God speaking. "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. But God then goes on to tell Abram to get some animals and to cut them in half and set them against each other, kind of creating an aisle in the middle. And what he's asking him to do is actually create a covenant. Abram would have been prepared for this. He would have known what God was asking. The root word of covenant in Hebrew actually means to cut. So it would have connotations akin to saying to cut a covenant. That would be appropriate. And Abram would have known exactly what God was preparing to ask and preparing to do. Verse 12 we read, "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him." Moving forward in verse 17 we read, "When the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram." God walked the aisle. He walked through the aisle, and Abram did not. See, when one walked the aisle, one was committing and saying, "May I be cursed, and what happened to these animals happened to me. Should I break this covenant, or should this covenant ever be broken?" A unilateral covenant was made. Abram should have walked through. You see, the party that was the lower standing party, socially, economically, the one who might not be able to fulfill the covenant, they were usually the ones that walked through. Fast forward hundreds of years. And what do we find but there Jesus, body torn beyond recognition, walking the street of Jerusalem because that covenant had been broken time and time again by us. God fulfilled that covenant and made a better one in the sacrifice and atonement of his son. You see, we find here that the Pentateuch is the root of the redemptive process, and each thread that you pull on will always point to Jesus. Coming to Jesus at a young age, I enjoyed the Old Testament, and I just didn't fully appreciate it though. See, I would get bogged down in reading about lineages and laws that I would want to jump immediately to reading the Psalms or reading the New Testament. I didn't understand that these early stories point to the Redeemer himself. They pointed to Jesus and the God that just wants his children home in his presence. May we never overlook the Pentateuch or leave it aside or relegate it to historical narrative alone before the part containing all the Jesus bits. That's not what the Pentateuch is. The Pentateuch is the beginning of God's redemptive process. It points to the second coming, just as much as it points to the overall end of the book. May we discover the redemptive beginnings that are all throughout these first 5 books of the Bible that are known as the Pentateuch.